My Life and Work by Henry Ford, in collaboration with Samuel Crowther. Chapter 7. The Terror of the Machine. Repetitive labor, the doing of one thing over and over again, and always in the same way, is a terrifying prospect to a certain kind of mind. It is terrifying to me. I could not possibly do the same thing day in and day out, but to other minds, perhaps I might say to the majority of minds, repetitive operations hold no terrors. In fact, to some types of mind thought is absolutely appalling. To them, the ideal job is one where the creative instinct needs not be expressed. The jobs where it is necessary to put in mind as well as muscle have very few takers. We always need men who like a job because it is difficult. The average worker, I am sorry to say, wants a job in which he does not have to put forth much physical exertion. Above all, he wants a job in which he does not have to think. Those who have what might be called the creative type of mind and who thoroughly abhor monotony are apt to imagine that all other minds are similarly restless, and therefore to extend quite unwanted sympathy to the laboring man who day in and day out performs almost exactly the same operation. When you come right down to it, most jobs are repetitive. A businessman has a routine that he follows with great exactness. The work of a bank president is nearly all routine. The work of under-officers and clerks in a bank is purely routine. Indeed, for most purposes and most people, it is necessary to establish something in the way of a routine, and to make most motions purely repetitive. Otherwise, the individual will not get enough done to be able to live off his own exertions. There is no reason why any one with a creative mind should be at a monotonous job, for everywhere the need for creative men is pressing. There will never be a dearth of places for skilled people, but we have to recognize that the will to be skilled is not general, and even if the will be present, then the courage to go through with the training is absent. One cannot become skilled by mere wishing. There are far too many assumptions about what human nature ought to be and not enough research into what it is. Take the assumption that creative work can be undertaken only in the realm of vision. We speak of creative artists in music, painting, and the other arts. We seemingly limit their creative functions to productions that may be hung on gallery walls or played in concert halls, or otherwise displayed where idle and fastidious people gather to admire each other's culture. But if a man wants a field for vital creative work, let him come where he is dealing with higher laws than those of sound, or line, or color. Let him come where he may deal with the laws of personality. We want artists in industrial relationship. We want masters in industrial method, both from the standpoint of the producer and the product. We want those who can mold the political, social, industrial, and moral mass into a sound and shapely whole. We have limited the creative faculty too much and have used it for too trivial ends. We want men who can create the working design for all that is right and good and desirable in our life. Good intentions plus well thought out working designs can be put into practice and can be made to succeed. It is possible to increase the well-being of the working man, not by having him do less work, but by aiding him to do more. If the world will give its attention and interest and energy to the making of plans that will profit the other fellow as he is, then such plans can be established on a practical working basis. Such plans will endure, and they will be far the most profitable both in human and financial values. What this generation needs is a deep faith, a profound conviction in the practicability of righteousness, justice, and humanity in industry. If we cannot have these qualities, then we were better off without industry. Indeed, if we cannot get those qualities, the days of industry are numbered. But we can get them. We are getting them. If a man cannot earn his keep without the aid of machinery, is it benefiting him to withhold that machinery because attendance upon it may be monotonous, and let him starve, or is it better to put him in the way of a good living? Is a man the happier for starving? If he is the happier for using a machine to less than its capacity, is he happier for producing less than he might, and consequently getting less than his share of the world's goods in exchange? I have not been able to discover that repetitive labor injures a man in any way. I have been told by parlor experts that repetitive labor is soul, as well as body destroying, but that has not been the result of our investigations. There was one case of a man who all day long did little but step on a treadle release. He thought that the motion was making him one-sided. The medical examination did not show that he had been affected, but, of course, he was changed to another job that used a different set of muscles. In a few weeks he asked for his old job again. It would seem reasonable to imagine that going through the same set of motions daily for 8 hours would produce an abnormal body, but we have never had a case of it. We shift men wherever they ask to be shifted, and we should like regularly to change them. That would be entirely feasible if only the men would have it that way. They do not like changes which they do not themselves suggest. Some of the operations are undoubtedly monotonous, so monotonous that it seems scarcely possible that any man would care to continue long at the same job. Probably the most monotonous task in the whole factory is one in which a man picks up a gear with a steel hook, shakes it in a vat of oil, then turns it into a basket. The motion never varies. The gears come to him always in exactly the same place, he gives each one the same number of shakes, and he drops it into a basket which is always in the same place. No muscular energy is required, no intelligence is required. He does little more than wave his hands gently to and fro. The steel rod is so light. Yet the man on that job has been doing it for 8 solid years. He has saved and invested his money until now he has about $40,000, and he stubbornly resists every attempt to force him into a better job. The most thorough research has not brought out a single case of a man's mind being twisted or deadened by the work. The kind of mind that does not like repetitive work does not have to stay in it. The work in each department is classified according to its desirability and skill into classes A, B, and C, each class having anywhere from 10 to 30 different operations. A man comes directly from the employment office to Class C. As he gets better, he goes into Class B, and so on into Class A, and out of Class A into tool making or some supervisory capacity. It is up to him to place himself. If he stays in production, it is because he likes it. In a previous chapter, I noted that no one applying for work is refused on account of physical condition. This policy went into effect on January 12, 1914, at the time of setting the minimum wage at $5 a day and the working day at 8 hours. It carried with it the further condition that no one should be discharged on account of physical condition except, of course, in the case of contagious disease. I think that if an industrial institution is to fill its whole role, it ought to be possible for a cross-section of its employees to show about the same proportions as a cross-section of a society in general. We have always with us the maimed and the halt. There is a most generous disposition to regard all of these people who who are physically incapacitated for labor as a charge on society, and to support them by charity. There are cases where I imagine that the support must be charity, as, for instance, an idiot, but those cases are extraordinarily rare, and we have found it possible, among the great number of different tasks that must be performed somewhere in the company, to find an opening for almost anyone and on the basis of production. The blind man or cripple can, in the particular place to which he is assigned, perform just as much work and receive exactly the same pay as a wholly able-bodied man would. We do not prefer cripples, but we have demonstrated that they can earn full wages. It would be quite outside the spirit of what we are trying to do to take on men because they were crippled, pay them at a lower wage, and be content with a lower output. That might be directly helping the men, but it would not be helping them in the best way. The best way is always the way by which they can be put on a productive par with able-bodied men. I believe that there is very little occasion for charity in this world, that is, charity in the sense of making gifts. Most certainly business and charity cannot be combined. The purpose of a factory is to produce, and it ill serves the community in general unless it does produce to the utmost of its capacity. We are too ready to assume, without investigation, that the full possession of faculties is a condition requisite to the best performance of all jobs. To discover just what was the real situation, I had all of the different jobs in the factory classified to the kind of machine and work, whether the physical labor involved was light, medium, or heavy, whether it were a wet or dry job, and if not, with what kind of fluid, whether it were clean or dirty, near an oven or a furnace, the condition of the air, whether one or both hands had to be used, whether the employee stood or sat down at his work, whether it was noisy or quiet, whether it required accuracy, whether the light was natural or artificial, the number of pieces that had to be handled per hour, the weight of the material handled, and the description of the strain upon the worker. It turned out at the time of the inquiry that there were then 7,882 different jobs in the factory. Of these, 949 were classified as heavy work requiring strong, able-bodied, and practically physically perfect men. 3,338 required men of ordinary physical development and strength. The remaining 3,595 jobs were disclosed as requiring no physical exertion and could be performed by the slightest, weakest sort of men. In fact, most of them could be satisfactorily filled by women or older children. The lightest jobs were again classified to discover how many of them required the use of full faculties, and we found that 670 could be filled by legless men, 2,637 by one-legged men, 2 by armless men, 715 by one-armed men, and 10 by blind men. Therefore, out of 7,882 kinds of jobs, 4,034, although some of them required strength, did not require full physical capacity. That is, developed industry can provide wage for work for a higher average of standard men than are ordinarily included in any normal community. If the jobs in any one industry or, say, any one factory were analyzed as ours have been analyzed, the proportion might be very different. Yet I am quite sure that if work is sufficiently subdivided to the point of highest economy, there will be no dearth of places in which the physically incapacitated can do a man's job and get a man's wage. It is economically most wasteful to accept crippled men as charges and then to teach them trivial tasks like the weaving of baskets or some other form of unremunerative hand labor in the hope, not of aiding them to make a living, but of preventing despondency. When a man is taken on by the employment department, the theory is to put him into a job suited to his condition. If he is already at work and he does not seem able to perform the work, or if he does not like his work, he is given a transfer card, which he takes up to the transfer department, and after an examination he is tried out in some other work more suited to his condition or disposition. Those who are below the ordinary physical standards are just as good workers, rightly placed, as those who are above. For instance, a blind man was assigned to the stock department to count bolts and nuts for shipment to branch establishments. 2 other able-bodied men were already employed on this work. In 2 days the foreman sent a note to the transfer department releasing the able-bodied men because the blind man was able to do not only his own work but also the work that had formerly been done by the sound men. This salvage can be carried further. It is usually taken for granted that when a man is injured he is simply out of the running and should be paid an allowance. But there is always a period of convalescence, especially in fracture cases, where the man is strong enough to work, and indeed, by that time usually anxious to work, for the largest possible accident allowance can never be as great as a man's wage. If it were, then a business would simply have an additional tax put on it, and that tax would show up in the cost of the product. There would be less buying of the product, and therefore less work for somebody. That is an inevitable sequence that must always be borne in mind. We have experimented with bedridden men who were able to sit up. We put black oilcloth covers or aprons over the beds and set the men to work screwing nuts on small bolts. This is a job that has to be done by hand and on which 15 or 20 men are kept busy in the magneto department. The men in the hospital could do it just as well as the men in the shop, and they were able to receive their regular wages. In fact, their production was about 20%, I believe, above the usual shop production. No man had to do the work unless he wanted to, but they all wanted to. It kept time from hanging on their hands. They slept and ate better and recovered more rapidly. No particular consideration has to be given to deaf and dumb employees. They do their work 100%. The tubercular employees, and there are usually about 1,000 of them, mostly work in the material salvage department. Those cases which are considered contagious work together in an especially constructed shed. The work of all of them is largely out of doors. At the time of the last analysis of employed, there were 9,563 substandard men. Of these, 123 had crippled or amputated arms, forearms, or hands. One had both hands off. There were 4 totally blind men, 207 blind in one eye, 253 with one eye nearly blind, 37 deaf and dumb, 60 epileptics, 4 with both legs or feet missing, 234 with one foot or leg missing. The others had minor impediments. The length of time required to become proficient in the various occupations is about as follows. 43% of all the jobs require not over 1 day of training, 36% require from 1 day to 1 week, 6% require from 1 to 2 weeks, 14% require from 1 month to 1 year, 1% require from 1 to 6 years. The last jobs require great skill, as in tool making and die sinking. The discipline throughout the plant is rigid. There are no petty rules, and no rules the justice of which can reasonably be disputed. The injustice of arbitrary discharge is avoided by confining the right of discharge to the employment manager, and he rarely exercises it. The year 1919 is the last on which statistics were kept. In that year, 30,155 changes occurred. Of those, 10,334 were absent more than 10 days without notice and therefore dropped, because they refused the job assigned or, without giving cause, demanded a transfer. 3,702 were let go. A refusal to learn English in the school provided accounted for 38 more. 108 enlisted. About 3,000 were transferred to other plants. Going home, going into farming or business accounted for about the same number. 82 women were discharged because their husbands were working. We do not employ married women whose husbands have jobs. Out of the whole lot, only 80 were flatly discharged, and the causes were misrepresentation 56, by order of Educational Department 20, and undesirable 4. We expect the men to do what they are told. The organization is so highly specialized, and one part is so dependent upon another, that we could not for a moment consider allowing men to have their own way. Without the most rigid discipline, we would have the utmost confusion. I think it should not be otherwise in industry. The men are there to get the greatest possible amount of work done and to receive the highest possible pay. If each man were permitted to act in his own way, production would suffer, and therefore pay would suffer. Anyone who does not like to work in our way may always leave. The company's conduct toward the men is meant to be exact and impartial. It is naturally to the interest both of the foremen and of the department heads that the releases from their departments should be few. The workman has a full chance to tell his story if he has been unjustly treated. He has full recourse. Of course, it is inevitable that injustices occur. Men are not always fair with their fellow workmen. Defective human nature obstructs our good intentions now and then. The foreman does not always get the idea or misapplies it, but the company's intentions are as I have stated, and we use every means to have them understood. It is necessary to be most insistent in the matter of absences. A man may not come or go as he pleases. He may always apply for leave to the foreman, but if he leaves without notice, then, on his return, the reasons for his absence are carefully investigated and are sometimes referred to the medical department. If his reasons are good, he is permitted to resume work. If they are not good, he may be discharged. On hiring a man, the only data taken concerns his name, his address, his age, whether he is married or single, the number of his dependents, whether he has ever worked for the Ford Motor Company, and the condition of his sight and his hearing. No questions are asked concerning what the man has previously done, but we have what we called the Better Advantage Notice, by which a man who has had a trade before he came to us files a notice with the employment department stating what the trade was. In this way, when we need specialists of any kind, we can get them right out of production. This is also one of the avenues by which tool makers and molders quickly reach the higher positions. I once wanted a Swiss watchmaker. The cards turned one up. He was running a drill press. The heat treat department wanted a skilled fire brick layer. He was also found on a drill press. He is now a general inspector. There is not much personal contact. The men do their work and go home. A factory is not a drawing room. But we try to have justice and, where there may be little in the way of handshaking, we have no professional handshakers. Also, we try to prevent opportunity for petty personalities. We have so many departments that the place is almost a world in itself. Every kind of man can find a place somewhere in it. Take fighting between men. Men will fight, and usually fighting is a cause for discharge on the spot. We find that does not help the fighters. It merely gets them out of our sight. So the foremen have become rather ingenious in devising punishments that will not take anything away from the man's family and which require no time at all to administer. One point that is absolutely essential to high capacity as well as to humane production is a clean, well-lighted, and well-ventilated factory. Our machines are placed very close together. Every foot of floor space in the factory carries, of course, the same overhead charge. The consumer must pay the extra overhead and the extra transportation involved in having machines even 6 inches farther apart than they have to be. We measure on each job the exact amount of room that a man needs. He must not be cramped. That would be waste. But if he and his machine occupy more space than is required, that is also waste. This brings our machines closer together than in probably any other factory in the world. To a stranger, they may seem piled right on top of one another, but they are scientifically arranged, not only in the sequence of operations, but to give every man and every machine every square inch that he requires and, if possible, not a square inch, and certainly not a square foot, more than he requires. Our factory buildings are not intended to be used as parks. The close placing requires a maximum of safeguards and ventilation. Machine safeguarding is a subject all of itself. We do not consider any machine, no matter how efficiently it may turn out its work, as a proper machine unless it is absolutely safe. We have no machines that we consider unsafe, but even at that, a few accidents will happen. Every accident, no matter how trivial, is traced back by a skilled man employed solely for that purpose, and a study is made of the machine to make that same accident in the future impossible. When we put up the other buildings, we did not understand so much about ventilation as we do today. In all the later buildings, the supporting columns are made hollow, and through them the bad air is pumped out and the good air introduced. A nearly even temperature is kept everywhere the year round, and, during daylight, there is nowhere the necessity for artificial light. Something like 700 men are detailed exclusively to keeping the shops clean, the windows washed, and all of the paint fresh. The dark corners which invite expectoration are painted white. One cannot have morale without cleanliness. We tolerate makeshift cleanliness no more than makeshift methods. No reason exists why factory work should be dangerous. If a man has worked too hard or through too long hours, he gets into a mental state that invites accidents. Part of the work of preventing accidents is to avoid this mental state. Part is to prevent carelessness, and part is to make machinery absolutely foolproof. The principal causes of accidents, as they are grouped by the experts, are 1. Defective structures, 2. Defective machines, 3. Insufficient room, 4. Absence of safeguards, 5. unclean conditions. 6. Bad lights. 7. Bad air. 8. Unsuitable clothing. 9. Carelessness. 10. Ignorance. 11. Mental condition. 12. Lack of cooperation. The questions of defective structures, defective machinery, insufficient room, unclean conditions, bad light, bad air, the wrong mental condition, and the lack of cooperation are easily disposed of. None of the men work too hard. The wages settle 9/10 of the mental problems, and construction gets rid of the others. We have, then, to guard against unsuitable clothing, carelessness, and ignorance, and to make everything we have foolproof. This is more difficult where we have belts. In all of our new construction, each machine has its individual electric motor, but in the older construction we had to use belts. Every belt is guarded. Over the automatic conveyors are placed bridges so that no man has to cross at a dangerous point. Wherever there is a possibility of flying metal, the workman is required to wear goggles, and the chances are further reduced by surrounding the machine with netting. Around hot furnaces we have railings. There is nowhere an open part of a machine in which clothing can be caught. All the aisles are kept clear. The starting switches of draw presses are protected by big red tags which have to be removed before the switch can be turned. This prevents the machine being started thoughtlessly. Workmen will wear unsuitable clothing, ties that may be caught in a pulley, flowing sleeves, and all manner of unsuitable articles. The bosses have to watch for that, and they catch most of the offenders. New machines are tested in every way before they are permitted to be installed. As a result, we have practically no serious accidents. Industry needs not exact a human toll. End of chapter 7. My Life and Work by Henry Ford, in collaboration with Samuel Crowther. Chapter 8. Wages. There is nothing to running a business by custom, to saying, I pay the going rate of wages. The same man would not so easily say, I have nothing better or cheaper to sell than anyone has. No manufacturer in his right mind would contend that buying only the cheapest materials is the way to make certain of manufacturing the best article. Then why do we hear so much talk about the liquidation of labor and the benefits that will flow to the country from cutting wages, which means only the cutting of buying power and the curtailing of the home market? What good is industry if it be so unskilfully managed as not to return a living to everyone concerned? No question is more important than that of wages. Most of the people of the country live on wages. The scale of their living, the rate of their wages, determines the prosperity of the country. Throughout all the Ford industries we now have a minimum wage of $6 a day. We used to have a minimum of $5. Before that we paid whatever it was necessary to pay. It would be bad morals to go back to the old market rate of paying, but also it would be the worst sort of bad business. First get at the relationships. It is not usual to speak of an employee as a partner, and yet what else is he? Whenever a man finds the management of a business too much for his own time or strength, he calls in assistants to share the management with him. Why, then, if a man finds the production part of a business too much for his own hands, should he deny the title of partner to those who come in and help him produce? Every business that employs more than one man is a kind of partnership. The moment a man calls for assistance in the business, even though the assistant be but a boy, that moment he has taken a partner. He may himself be sole owner of the resources of the business and sole director of its operations, but only while he remains sole manager and sole producer can he claim complete independence. No man is independent as long as he has to depend on another man to help him. It is a reciprocal relation. The boss is the partner of his worker, the worker is partner of his boss. And such being the case, it is useless for one group or the other to assume that it is the one indispensable unit. Both are indispensable. The one can become unduly assertive only at the expense of the other, and eventually at its own expense as well. It is utterly foolish for capital or for labor to think of themselves as groups. They are partners. When they pull and haul against each other, they simply injure the organization in which they are partners, and from which both draw support. It ought to be the employer's ambition, as leader, to pay better wages than any similar line of business, and it ought to be the workman's ambition to make this possible. Of course, there are men in all shops who seem to believe that if they do their best, it will be only for the employer's benefit, and not at all for their own. It is a pity that such a feeling should exist, but it does exist, and perhaps it has some justification. If an employer urges men to do their best, and the men learn after a while that their best does not bring any reward, then they naturally drop back into getting by. But if they see the fruits of hard work in their pay envelope, proof that harder work means higher pay, then also they begin to learn that they are a part of the business, and that its success depends on them and their success depends on it. What ought the employer to pay? What ought the employee to receive? These are but minor questions. The basic question is, what can the business stand? Certainly no business can stand outgo that exceeds income. When you pump water out of a well at a faster rate than the water flows in, the well goes dry, and when the well runs dry, those who depend on it go thirsty. And if, perchance, they imagine they can pump one well dry and then jump to some other well, it is only a matter of time when all the wells will be dry. There is now a widespread demand for more justly divided rewards, but it must be recognized that there are limits to rewards. The business itself sets the limits. You cannot distribute $150,000 out of a business that brings in only $100,000. The business limits the wages, but does anything limit the business? The business limits itself by following bad precedents. If men, instead of saying, "The employer ought to do thus and so," would say, "The business ought to be so stimulated and managed that it can do thus and so," they would get somewhere, because only the business can pay wages. Certainly the employer cannot, unless the business warrants. But if that business does warrant higher wages, and the employer refuses, what is to be done? As a rule, a business means the livelihood of too many men to be tampered with. It is criminal to assassinate a business to which large numbers of men have given their labors and to which they have learned to look as their field of usefulness and their source of livelihood. Killing the business by a strike or a lockout does not help. The employer can gain nothing by looking over the employees and asking himself, "How little can I get them to take?" Nor the employee by glaring back and asking, "How much can I force him to give?" Eventually both will have to turn to the business and ask, "How can this industry be made safe and profitable so that it will be able to provide a sure and comfortable living for all of us?" But by no means all employers or all employees will think straight. The habit of acting short-sightedly is a hard one to break. What can be done? Nothing. No rules or laws will effect the changes, but enlightened self-interest will. It takes a little while for enlightenment to spread, but spread it must, for the concern in which both employer and employees work to the same end of service is bound to forge ahead in business. What do we mean by high wages, anyway? We mean a higher wage than was paid 10 months or 10 years ago. We do not mean a higher wage than ought to be paid. Our high wages of today may be low wages 10 years from now. If it is right for the manager of a business to try to make it pay larger dividends, it is quite as right that he should try to make it pay higher wages. But it is not the manager of the business who pays the high wages. Of course, if he can and will not, then the blame is on him, but he alone can never make high wages possible. High wages cannot be paid unless the workmen earn them. Their labor is the productive factor. It is not the only productive factor. Poor management can waste labor and material and nullify the efforts of labor. Labor can nullify the results of good management, but in a partnership of skilled management and honest labor, it is the workman who makes high wages possible. He invests his energy and skill, and if he makes an honest, wholehearted investment, high wages ought to be his reward. Not only has he earned them, but he has had a big part in creating them. It ought to be clear, however, that the high wage begins down in the shop. If it is not created there, it cannot get into pay envelopes. There will never be a system invented which will do away with the necessity of work. Nature has seen to that. Idle hands and minds were never intended for any one of us. Work is our sanity, our self-respect, our salvation. So far from being a curse, work is the greatest blessing. Exact social justice flows only out of honest work. The man who contributes much should take away much. Therefore, no element of charity is present in the paying of wages. The kind of workman who gives the business the best that is in him is the best kind of workman a business can have, and he cannot be expected to do this indefinitely without proper recognition of his contribution. The man who comes to the day's job feeling that no matter how much he may give, it will not yield him enough of a return to keep him beyond want is not in shape to do his day's work. He is anxious and worried, and it all reacts to the detriment of his work. But if a man feels that his day's work is not only supplying his basic need, but is also giving him a margin of comfort and enabling him to give his boys and girls their opportunity and his wife some pleasure in life, then his job looks good to him, and he is free to give it of his best. This is a good thing for him and a good thing for the business. The man who does not get a certain satisfaction out of his day's work is losing the best part of his pay. For the day's work is a great thing, a very great thing. It is at the very foundation of the world. It is the basis of our self-respect. And the employer ought constantly to put in a harder day's work than any of his men. The employer who is seriously trying to do his duty in the world must be a hard worker. He cannot say, "I have so many thousand men working for me." The fact of the matter is that so many thousand men have been working for them, and the better they work the busier they keep him disposing of their products. Wages and salaries are in fixed amounts, and this must be so in order to have a basis to figure on. Wages and salaries are a sort of profit sharing fixed in advance, but it often happens that when the business of the year is closed, it is discovered that more can be paid, and then more ought to be paid. When we are all in the business working together, we all ought to have some share in the profits, by way of a good wage, or salary, or added compensation. And that is beginning now quite generally to be recognized. There is now a definite demand that the human side of business be elevated to a position of equal importance with the material side, and that is going to come about. It is just a question whether it is going to be brought about wisely, in a way that will conserve the material side which now sustains us, or unwisely and in such a way as shall take from us all the benefit of the work of the past years. Business represents our national livelihood. It reflects our economic progress and gives us our place among other nations. We do not want to jeopardize that. What we want is a better recognition of the human element in business. And surely it can be achieved without dislocation, without loss to anyone, indeed with an increase of benefit to every human being. And the secret of all of it is in a recognition of human partnership. Until each man is absolutely sufficient unto himself, needing the services of no other human being in any capacity whatever, we shall never get beyond the need of partnership. Such are the fundamental truths of wages. They are partnership distributions. When can a wage be considered adequate? How much of a living is reasonably to be expected from work? Have you ever considered what a wage does or ought to do? To say that it should pay the cost of living is to say almost nothing. The cost of living depends largely upon the efficiency of production and transportation, and the efficiency of these is the sum of the efficiencies of the management and the workers. Good work, well managed, ought to result in high wages and low living costs. If we attempt to regulate wages on living costs, we get nowhere. The cost of living is a result, and we cannot expect to keep a result constant if we keep altering the factors which produce the result. When we try to regulate wages according to the cost of living, we are imitating a dog chasing his tail, and anyhow, who is competent to say just what kind of living we shall base the costs on? Let us broaden our view and see what a wage is to the workman, and what it ought to be. The wage carries all the worker's obligations outside the shop. It carries all that is necessary in the way of service and management inside the shop. The day's productive work is the most valuable mine of wealth that has ever been opened. Certainly it ought to bear not less than all the worker's outside obligations, and certainly it ought to be made to take care of the worker's sunset days when labor is no longer possible to him, and should be no longer necessary. And if it is made to do even these, industry will have to be adjusted to a schedule of production, distribution, and reward, which will stop the leaks into the pockets of men who do not assist in production. In order to create a system which shall be as independent of the good will of benevolent employers as of the ill will of selfish ones, we shall have to find a basis in the actual facts of life itself. It costs just as much physical strength to turn out a day's work when wheat is $1 a bushel as when wheat is $2.50 a bushel. Eggs may be 12 cents a dozen or 90 cents a dozen. What difference does it make in the units of energy a man uses in a productive day's work? If only the man himself were concerned, the cost of his maintenance and the profit he ought to have would be a simple matter. But he is not just an individual. He is a citizen, contributing to the welfare of the nation. He is a householder. He is perhaps a father with children who must be reared to usefulness on what he is able to earn. We must reckon with all these facts. how are you going to figure the contribution of the home to the day's work? You can pay the man for his work, but how much does that work owe to his home? How much to his position as a citizen? How much to his position as a father? One man does the work in the shop, but his wife does the work in the home. The shop must pay them both. On what system of figuring is the home going to find its place on the cost sheets of the day's work? Is the man's own livelihood to be regarded as the cost, and is his ability to have a home and family the profit? Is the profit on a day's work to be computed on a cash basis only, measured by the amount a man has left over after his own and his family's wants are all supplied? Or are all these relationships to be considered strictly under the head of cost, and the profit to be computed entirely outside of them? That is, after having supported himself and family, clothed them, housed them, educated them, given them the privileges incident to their standard of living, ought there to be provision made for still something more in the way of savings profit? And are all properly chargeable to the day's work? I think they are. Otherwise, we will have the hideous prospect of little children and their mothers being forced out to work. These are questions which call for accurate observation and computation. Perhaps there is no one item connected with our economic life that would surprise us more than a knowledge of just what burdens the day's work. It is perhaps possible accurately to determine, albeit with considerable interference with the day's work itself, how much energy the day's work takes out of a man, but it is not at all possible accurately to determine how much it will require to put back that energy into him against the next day's demands. Nor is it possible to determine how much of that expended energy he will never be able to get back at all. Economics has never yet devised a sinking fund for the replacement of the strength of a worker. It is possible to set up a kind of sinking fund in the form of old age pensions. But pensions do not attend to the profit which each day's labor ought to yield in order to take care of all life's overhead, of all physical losses, and of the inevitable deterioration of the manual worker. The best wages that have up to date ever been paid are not nearly as high as they ought to be. Business is not yet sufficiently well organized, and its objectives are not yet sufficiently clear to make it possible to pay more than a fraction of the wages that ought to be paid. That is part of the work we have before us. It does not help toward a solution to talk about abolishing the wage system and substituting communal ownership. The wage system is the only one that we have under which contributions to production can be rewarded according to their worth. Take away the wage measure, and we shall have universal injustice. Perfect the system, and we may have universal justice. I have learned through the years a good deal about wages. I believe in the first place that, all other considerations aside, our own sales depend in a measure upon the wages we pay. If we can distribute high wages, then that money is going to be spent, and it will serve to make storekeepers and distributors and manufacturers and workers in other lines more prosperous, and their prosperity will be reflected in our sales. Country-wide high wages spell country-wide prosperity, provided, however, the higher wages are paid for higher production. Paying high wages and lowering production is starting down the incline toward dull business. It took us some time to get our bearings on wages, and it was not until we had gone thoroughly into production on Model T that it was possible to figure out what wages ought to be. Before then, we had had some profit sharing. We had at the end of each year, for some years past, divided a percentage of our earnings with the employees. For instance, as long ago as 1909, we distributed $80,000 on the basis of years of service. A one-year man received 5% of his year's wages, a two-year man 7.5%, and a three-year man 10%. The objection to that plan was that it had no direct connection with the day's work. A man did not get his share until long after his work was done, and then it came to him almost in the way of a present. It is always unfortunate to have wages tinged with charity. And then, too, the wages were not scientifically adjusted to the jobs. The man in job A might get one rate, and the man in job B a higher rate, while as a matter of fact, job A might require more skill or exertion than job B. A great deal of inequity creeps into wage rates unless both the employer and the employee know that the rate paid has been arrived at by something better than a guess. Therefore, starting about 1913, we had time studies made of all the thousands of operations in the shops. By a time study, it is possible theoretically to determine what a man's output should be. Then, making large allowances, it is further possible to get at a satisfactory standard output for a day, and, taking into consideration the skill, to arrive at a rate which will express with fair accuracy the amount of skill and exertion that goes into a job, and how much is to be expected from the man in the job in return for the wage. Without scientific study, the employer does not know why he is paying a wage, and the worker does not know why he is getting it. On the time figures, all of the jobs in our factory were standardized and rates set. We do not have piecework. Some of the men are paid by the day, and some are paid by the hour, but in practically every case there is a required standard output below which a man is not expected to fall. Were it otherwise, neither the workmen nor ourselves would know whether or not wages were being earned. There must be a fixed day's work before a real wage can be paid. Watchmen are paid for presence, workmen are paid for work. Having these facts in hand, we announced and put into operation in January 1914 a kind of profit-sharing plan in which the minimum wage for any class of work and under certain conditions was $5 a day. At the same time, we reduced the working day to 8 hours. It had been 9, and the week to 48 hours. This was entirely a voluntary act. All of our wage rates have been voluntary. It was to our way of thinking an act of social justice, and in the last analysis we did for our own satisfaction of mind. There is a pleasure in feeling that you have made others happy, that you have lessened in some degree the burdens of your fellow men, that you have provided a margin out of which may be had pleasure and saving. Goodwill is one of the few really important assets of life. A determined man can win almost anything that he goes after, but unless, in his getting, he gains goodwill, he has not profited much. There was, however, no charity in any way involved. That was not generally understood. Many employers thought we were just making the announcement because we were prosperous and wanted advertising as they condemned us because we were upsetting standards, violating the custom of paying a man the smallest amount he would take. There is nothing to such standards and customs. They have to be wiped out. Some day they will be. Otherwise we cannot abolish poverty. We made the change not merely because we wanted to pay higher wages and thought we could pay them. We wanted to pay these wages so that the business would be on a lasting foundation. We were not distributing anything. We were building for the future. A low-wage business is always insecure. Probably few industrial announcements have created a more worldwide comment than did this one, and hardly any one got the facts quite right. Workmen quite generally believed that they were going to get $5 a day regardless of what work they did. The facts were somewhat different from the general impression. The plan was to distribute profits, but instead of waiting until the profits had been earned, to approximate them in advance and to add to them, under certain conditions, to the wages of those persons who had been in the employ of the company for 6 months or more. It was classified participation among 3 classes of employees. 1. Married men living with and taking good care of their families. 2. Single men over 22 years of age who are of proved thrifty habits. 3. Young men under 22 years of age and women who are the sole support of some next of kin. A man was first to be paid his just wages, which were then on an average of about 15% above the usual market wage. He was then eligible to a certain profit. His wages plus his profit were calculated to give a minimum daily income of $5. The profit-sharing rate was divided on an hour basis and was credited to the hourly wage rate so as to give those receiving the lowest hourly rate the largest proportion of profits. It was paid every 2 weeks with the wages. For example, a man who received 34 cents an hour had a profit rate of 28½ cents an hour, which would give him a daily income of $5. A man receiving 54 cents an hour would have a profit rate of 21 cents an hour, which would give him a daily income of $6. It was a sort of prosperity sharing plan, but on conditions. The man and his home had to come up to certain standards of cleanliness and citizenship. Nothing paternal was intended. A certain amount of paternalism did develop, and that is one reason why the whole plan and the social welfare development were readjusted. But in the beginning, the idea was that there should be a very definite incentive to better living, and that the very best incentive was a money premium on proper living. A man who is living all right will do his work all right, and then, too, we wanted to avoid the possibility of lowering the standard of work through an increased wage. It was demonstrated in wartime that too quickly increasing a man's pay sometimes increases only his cupidity, and therefore decreases his earning power. If, in the beginning, we had simply put the increase in the pay envelopes, then very likely the work standards would have broken down. The pay of about half the men was doubled in the new plan. It might have been taken as easy money. The thought of easy money breaks down work. There's a danger in too rapidly raising the pay of any man, whether he previously received $1 or $100 a day. In fact, if the salary of $100 a day man were increased overnight to $300 a day, he would probably make a bigger fool of himself than the working man whose pay is increased from $1 to $3 an hour. The man with the larger amount of money has larger opportunity to make a fool of himself. In this first plan, the standards insisted upon were not petty, although sometimes they may have been administered in a petty fashion. We had about 50 investigators in the social department. The standard of common sense among them was very high indeed, but it is impossible to assemble 50 men equally endowed with common sense. They erred at times. One always hears about the errors. It was expected that in order to receive the bonus, married men should live with and take proper care of their families. We had to break up the evil custom among many of the foreign workers of taking in boarders, of regarding their homes as something to make money out of rather than as a place to live in. Boys under 18 received the bonus if they supported the next of kin. Single men who lived wholesomely shared. The best evidence that the plan was essentially beneficial is the record. When the plan went into effect, 60% of the workers immediately qualified to share. At the end of 6 months, 78% were sharing, and at the end of 1 year, 87%. Within a year and one half, only a fraction of 1% failed to share. The large wage had other results. In 1914, when the first plan went into effect, we had 14,000 employees, and it had been necessary to hire at the rate of about 53,000 a year in order to keep a constant force of 14,000. In 1915, we had to hire only 6,508 men, and the majority of these new men were taken on because of the growth of the business. With the old turnover of labor and our present force, we should have to hire at the rate of nearly 200,000 men a year, which would be pretty nearly an impossible proposition. Even with the minimum of instruction that is required to master almost any job in our place, we cannot take on a new staff each morning, or each week, or each month, for although a man may qualify for acceptable work at an acceptable rate of speed within 2 or 3 days, he will be able to do more after a year's experience than he did at the beginning. The matter of labor turnover has not since bothered us. It is rather hard to give exact figures because when we are not running to capacity, we rotate some of the men in order to distribute the work among the greatest number. This makes it hard to distinguish between the voluntary and involuntary exits. Today, we keep no figures. We now think so little of our turnover that we do not bother to keep records. As far as we know, the turnover is somewhere between 3% and 6% a month. We have made changes in the system, but we have not deviated from this principle. If you expect a man to give his time and energy, fix his wages so that he will have no financial worries. It pays. Our profits, after paying good wages and a bonus, which bonus used to run around 10 millions a year before we changed the system, show that paying good wages is the most profitable way of doing business. There were objections to the bonus on conduct method of paying wages. It tended toward paternalism. Paternalism has no place in industry. Welfare work that consists in prying into employees' private concerns is out of date. Men need counsel and men need help, oftentimes special help, and all this ought to be rendered for decency's sake. But the broad workable plan of investment and participation will do more to solidify industry and strengthen organization than will any social work on the outside. Without changing the principle, we have changed the method of payment. End of chapter 8. My Life and Work by Henry Ford, in collaboration with Samuel Crowther. Chapter 9. Why Not Always Have Good Business. The employer has to live by the year. The workman has to live by the year. But both of them, as a rule, work by the week. They get an order or a job when they can and at the price they can. During what is called a prosperous time, orders and jobs are plentiful. During a dull season they are scarce. Business is always either feasting or fasting, and is always either good or bad. Although there is never a time when everyone has too much of this world's goods, when everyone is too comfortable or too happy, there come periods when we have the astounding spectacle of a world hungry for goods, and an industrial machine hungry for work, and the two, the demand and the means of satisfying it, held apart by a money barrier. Both manufacturing and employment are in and out affairs. Instead of a steady progression, we go ahead by fits and starts, now going too fast, now stopping altogether. When a great many people want to buy, there is said to be a shortage of goods. When nobody wants to buy, there is said to be an overproduction of goods. I know that we have always had a shortage of goods, but I do not believe we have ever had an overproduction. We may have, at a particular time, too much of the wrong kind of goods. That is not overproduction. That is merely headless production. We may also have great stocks of goods at too high prices. That is not overproduction. It is either bad manufacturing or bad financing. Is business good or bad according to the dictates of fate? Must we accept the conditions as inevitable? Business is good or bad as we make it so. The only reason for growing crops, for mining, or for manufacturing is that people may eat, keep warm, have clothing to wear, and articles to use. There is no other possible reason. Yet that reason is forced into the background, and instead we have operations carried on, not to the end of service, but to the end of making money. And this because we have evolved a system of money that instead of being a convenient medium of exchange, is at times a barrier to exchange. Of this more later. We suffer frequent periods of so-called bad luck only because we manage so badly. If we had a vast crop failure, I can imagine the country going hungry, but I cannot conceive how it is that we tolerate hunger and poverty when they grow solely out of bad management, and especially out of the bad management that is implicit in an unreasoned financial structure. Of course the war upset affairs in this country. It upset the whole world. There would have been no war had management been better, but the war alone is not to blame. The war showed up a great number of the defects of the financial system, but more than anything else, it showed how insecure is business supported only by a money foundation. I do not know whether bad business is the result of bad financial methods, or whether the wrong motive in business created bad financial methods. But I do know that, while it would be wholly undesirable to try to overturn the present financial system, it is wholly desirable to reshape business on the basis of service. Then a better financial system will have to come. The present system will drop out because it will have no reason for being. The process will have to be a gradual one. The start toward the stabilization of his own affairs may be made by any one. One cannot achieve perfect results acting alone, but as the example begins to sink in, there will be followers, and thus in the course of time we can hope to put inflated business and its fellow, depressed business, into a class with smallpox, that is, into the class of preventable diseases. It is perfectly possible, with the reorganization of business and finance that is bound to come about, to take the ill effect of seasons, if not the seasons, out of industry, and also the periodic depressions. Farming is already in process of reorganization. When industry and farming are fully reorganized, they will be complementary. They belong together, not apart. As an indication, take our valve plant. We established it 18 miles out in the country, so that the workers could also be farmers. By the use of machinery, farming need not consume more than a fraction of the time it now consumes. The time nature requires to produce is much larger than that required for the human contribution of seeding, cultivating, and harvesting. In many industries where the parts are not bulky, it does not make much difference where they are made. By the aid of water power they can well be made out in farming country. Thus we can, to a much larger degree than is commonly known, have farmer industrialists who both farm and work under the most scientific and healthful conditions. That arrangement will care for some seasonal industries. Others can arrange a succession of products according to the seasons and the equipment, and still others can, with more careful management, iron out their seasons. A complete study of any specific problem will show the way. The periodic depressions are more serious because they seem so vast as to be uncontrollable. Until the whole reorganization is brought about, they cannot be wholly controlled, but each man in business can easily do something for himself while benefiting his own organization in a very material way, also help others. The Ford production has not reflected good times or bad times. It has kept right on, regardless of conditions, excepting from 1917 to 1919, when the factory was turned over to war work. The year 1912 to 1913 was supposed to be a dull one, although now some call it normal. We all but doubled our sales. 1913 to 1914 was dull. We increased our sales by more than a third. The year 1920 to 1921 is supposed to have been one of the most depressed in history. We sold 1,250,000 cars, or about 5 times as many as in 1913 to 1914, the normal year. There is no particular secret in it. It is, as is everything else in our business, the inevitable result of the application of a principle which can be applied to any business. We now have a minimum wage of $6 a day paid without reservation. The people are sufficiently used to high wages to make supervision unnecessary. The minimum wage is paid just as soon as a worker has qualified in his production, which is a matter that depends upon his own desire to work. We have put our estimate of profits into the wage and are now paying higher wages than during the boom times after the war. But we are, as always, paying them on the basis of work. And that the men do work is evidenced by the fact that although $6 a day is the minimum wage, about 60% of the workers receive above the minimum. The $6 is not a flat, but a minimum wage. Consider first the fundamentals of prosperity. Progress is not made by pulling off a series of stunts. Each step has to be regulated. A man cannot expect to progress without thinking. Take prosperity. A truly prosperous time is when the largest number of people are getting all they can legitimately eat and wear, and are in every sense of the word comfortable. It is a degree of the comfort of the people at large, not the size of the manufacturer's bank balance, that evidences prosperity. The function of the manufacturer is to contribute to this comfort. He is an instrument of society, and he can serve society only as he manages his enterprises so as to turn over to the public an increasingly better product at an ever decreasing price, and at the same time to pay to all those who have a hand in his business an ever increasing wage, based upon the work they do. In this way and in this way alone can a manufacturer or anyone in business justify his existence. We are not much concerned with the statistics and the theories of the economists on the recurring cycles of prosperity and depression. They call the periods when prices are high prosperous. A really prosperous period is not to be judged on the prices that manufacturers are quoting for articles. We are not concerned with combinations of words. If the prices of goods are above the incomes of the people, then get the prices down to the incomes. Ordinarily, business is conceived as starting with a manufacturing process and ending with a consumer. If that consumer does not want to buy what the manufacturer has to sell him and has not the money to buy it, then the manufacturer blames the consumer and says that business is bad. And thus, hitching the cart before the horse, he goes on his way lamenting. Isn't that nonsense? Does the manufacturer exist for the consumer, or does the consumer exist for the manufacturer? If the consumer will not, says he cannot, buy what the manufacturer has to offer, is that the fault of the manufacturer or the consumer, or is nobody at fault? If nobody is at fault, then the manufacturer must go out of business. But what business ever started with the manufacturer and ended with the consumer? Where does the money to make the wheels go round come from? From the consumer, of course, and success in manufacture is based solely upon an ability to serve that consumer to his liking. He may be served by quality, or he may be served by price. He is best served by the highest quality at the lowest price, and any man who can give to the consumer the highest quality at the lowest price is bound to be a leader in business, whatever the kind of an article he makes. There is no getting away from this. Then why flounder around waiting for good business? Get the costs down by better management. Get the prices down to the buying power. Cutting wages is the easiest and most slovenly way to handle the situation, not to speak of it being an inhuman way. It is, in effect, throwing upon labor the incompetency of the managers of the business. If we only knew it, every depression is a challenge to every manufacturer to put more brains into his business, to overcome by management what other people try to overcome by wage reduction. To tamper with wages before all else is changed is to evade the real issue. And if the real issue is tackled first, no reduction of wages may be necessary. That has been my experience. The immediate practical point is that, in the process of adjustment, someone will have to take a loss. And who can take a loss except those who have something which they can afford to lose? But the expression, take a loss, is rather misleading. Really, no loss is taken at all. It is only a giving up of a certain part of the past profits in order to gain more in the future. I was talking not long since with a hardware merchant in a small town. He said, "I expect to take a loss of $10,000 on my stock. But of course, you know, it isn't really like losing that much. We hardware men have had pretty good times. Most of my stock was bought at high prices, but I have already sold several stocks and had the benefit of them. Besides, the $10,000 which I say I will lose are not the same kind of dollars that I used to have. They are, in a way, speculative dollars. They are not the good dollars that bought 100 cents worth. So, though my loss may sound big, it is not big. And at the same time I am making it possible for the people in my town to go on building their houses without being discouraged by the size of the hardware item. He is a wise merchant. He would rather take less profit and keep business moving than keep his stock at high prices and bar the progress of his community. A man like that is an asset to a town. He has a clear head. He is better able to swing the adjustment through his inventory than through cutting down the wages of his delivery men through cutting down their ability to buy. He did not sit around holding on to his prices and waiting for something to turn up. He realized what seems to have been quite generally forgotten, that it is part of proprietorship every now and again to lose money. We had to take our loss. Our sales eventually fell off as all other sales fell off. We had a large inventory and, taking the materials and parts in that inventory at their cost price, we could not turn out a car at a price lower than we were asking. But that was a price which on the turn of business was higher than people could or wanted to pay. We closed down to get our bearings. We were faced with making a cut of $17 million in the inventory or taking a much larger loss than that by not doing business. So there was no choice at all. That is always the choice that a man in business has. He can take the direct loss on his books and go ahead and do business, or he can stop doing business and take the loss of idleness. The loss of not doing business is commonly a loss greater than the actual money involved, for during the period of idleness fear will consume initiative and, if the shutdown is long enough, there will be no energy left over to start up with again. There is no use waiting around for business to improve. If a manufacturer wants to perform his function, he must get his price down to what people will pay. There is always, no matter what the condition, a price that people can and will pay for a necessity, and always, if the will is there, that price can be met. It cannot be met by lowering quality, or by short-sighted economy, which results only in a dissatisfied working force. It cannot be met by fussing or buzzing around. It can be met only by increasing the efficiency of production, and, viewed in this fashion, each business depression so called ought to be regarded as a challenge to the brains of the business community. Concentrating on prices instead of on service is a sure indication of the kind of businessman who can give no justification for his existence as a proprietor. This is only another way of saying that sales should be made on the natural basis of real value, which is the cost of transmuting human energy into articles of trade and commerce. But that simple formula is not considered businesslike. It is not complex enough. We have business which takes the most honest of all human activities and makes them subject to the speculative shrewdness of men who can produce false shortages of food and other commodities and thus excite in society anxiety of demand. We have false stimulation and then false numbness. Economic justice is being constantly and quite often innocently violated. You may say that it is the economic condition which makes mankind what it is, or you may say that it is mankind that makes the economic condition what it is. You will find many claiming that it is the economic system which makes men what they are. They blame our industrial system for all the faults which we behold in mankind generally. And you will find other men who say that man creates his own conditions, that if the economic, industrial, or social system is bad, it is but a reflection of what man himself is. What is wrong in our industrial system is a reflection of what is wrong in man himself. Manufacturers hesitate to admit that the mistakes of the present industrial methods are, in part at least, their own mistakes, systematized and extended. But take the question outside of a man's immediate concerns, and he sees the point readily enough. No doubt, with a less faulty human nature, a less faulty social system would have grown up, or, if human nature were worse than it is, a worse system would have grown up, though probably a worse system would not have lasted as long as the present one has. But few will claim that mankind deliberately set out to create a faulty social system. Granting without reserve that all faults of the social system are in man himself, it does not follow that he deliberately organized his imperfections and established them. We shall have to charge a great deal up to ignorance. We shall have to charge a great deal up to innocence. Take the beginnings of our present industrial system. There was no indication of how it would grow. Every new advance was hailed with joy. No one ever thought of capital and labor as hostile interests. No one ever dreamed that the very fact of success would bring insidious dangers with it. And yet with growth, every imperfection latent in the system came out. A man's business grew to such proportions that he had to have more helpers than he knew by their first names. But that fact was not regretted. It was rather hailed with joy. And yet it has since led to an impersonal system wherein the workman has become something less than a person, a mere part of the system. No one believes, of course, that this dehumanizing process was deliberately invented. It just grew. It was latent in the whole early system, but no one saw it and no one could foresee it. Only prodigious and unheard of development could bring it to light. Take the industrial idea. What is it? The true industrial idea is not to make money. The industrial idea is to express a serviceable idea, to duplicate a useful idea by as many thousands as there are people who need it. To produce, produce. To get a system that will reduce production to a fine art, to put production on such a basis as will provide means for expansion and the building of still more shops, the production of still more thousands of useful things, that is the real industrial idea. The negation of the industrial idea is the effort to make a profit out of speculation instead of out of work. There are short-sighted men who cannot see that business is bigger than any one man's interests. Business is a process of give and take, live and let live. It is cooperation among many forces and interests. Whenever you find a man who believes that business is a river whose beneficial flow ought to stop as soon as it reaches him, you find a man who thinks he can keep business alive by stopping its circulation. He would produce wealth by this stopping of the production of wealth. The principles of service cannot fail to cure bad business, which leads us into the practical application of the principles of service and finance. End of chapter 9. My Life and Work by Henry Ford in collaboration with Samuel Crowther. Chapter 10. How Cheaply Can Things Be Made? No one will deny that if prices are sufficiently low, buyers will always be found, no matter what are supposed to be the business conditions. That is one of the elemental facts of business. Sometimes raw materials will not move, no matter how low the price. We have seen something of that during the last year, but that is because the manufacturers and the distributors were trying to dispose of high-cost stocks before making new engagements. The markets were stagnant, but not saturated with goods. What is called a saturated market is only one in which the prices are above the purchasing power. Unduly high prices are always a sign of unsound business, because they are always due to some abnormal condition. A healthy patient has a normal temperature. A healthy market has normal prices. High prices come about commonly by reason of speculation following the report of a shortage. Although there is never a shortage in everything, a shortage in just a few important commodities, or even in one, serves to start speculation, or again, goods may not be short at all. An inflation of currency or credit will cause a quick bulge in apparent buying power and the consequent opportunity to speculate. There may be a combination of actual shortages and a currency inflation, as frequently happens during war. But in any condition of unduly high prices, no matter what the real cause, the people pay the high prices because they think there is going to be a shortage. They may buy bread ahead of their own needs, so as not to be left later in the lurch, or they may buy in the hope of reselling at a profit. When there was talk of a sugar shortage, housewives who never in their lives bought more than 10 pounds of sugar at once tried to get stocks of 100 or 200 pounds, and while they were doing this, speculators were buying sugar to store in warehouses. Nearly all our war shortages were caused by speculation or buying ahead of need. No matter how short the supply of an article is supposed to be, no matter if the government takes control and seizes every ounce of that article, a man who is willing to pay the money can always get whatever supply he is willing to pay for. No one ever knows actually how great or how small is the national stock of any commodity. The very best figures are not more than guesses. Estimates of the world's stock of a commodity are still wilder. We may think we know how much of a commodity is produced on a certain day or in a certain month, but that does not tell us how much will be produced the next day or the next month. Likewise, we do not know how much is consumed. By spending a great deal of money we might, in the course of time, get at fairly accurate figures on how much of a particular commodity was consumed over a period, but by the time those figures were compiled, they would be utterly useless, except for historical purposes, because in the next period the consumption might be double or half as much. People do not stay put. That is the trouble with all the framers of the socialistic and communistic and of all other plans for the ideal regulation of society. They all presume that people will stay put. The reactionary has the same idea. He insists that everyone ought to stay put. Nobody does, and for that I am thankful. Consumption varies according to the price and the quality, and nobody knows or can figure out what future consumption will amount to, because every time a price is lowered, a new stratum of buying power is reached. Everyone knows that, but many refuse to recognize it by their acts. When a storekeeper buys goods at a wrong price and finds they will not move, he reduces the price by degrees until they do move. If he is wise, instead of nibbling at the price and encouraging in his customers the hopes of even lower prices, he takes a great big bite out of the price and gets the stuff out of his place. Everyone takes a loss on some proposition of sales. The common hope is that after the loss there may be a big profit to make up for the loss. That is usually a delusion. The profit out of which the loss has to be taken must be found in the business preceding the cut. Anyone who was foolish enough to regard the high profits of the boom period as permanent profits got into financial trouble when the drop came. However, there is a belief, and a very strong one, that business consists of a series of profits and losses, and good business is one in which the profits exceed the losses. Therefore, some men reason that the best price to sell at is the highest price which might be had. That is supposed to be good business practice. Is it? We have not found so. We have found in buying materials that it is not worth while to buy for other than immediate needs. We buy only enough to fit into the plan of production, taking into consideration the state of transportation at the time. If transportation were perfect, and an even flow of materials could be assured, it would not be necessary to carry any stock whatsoever. The carload of raw materials would arrive on schedule and in the planned order and amounts, and go from the railway cars into production. That would save a great deal of money, for it would give a very rapid turnover and thus decrease the amount of money tied up in materials. With bad transportation, one has to carry larger stocks. At the time of revaluing the inventory in 1921, the stock was unduly high because transportation had been so bad. But we learned long ago never to buy ahead for speculative purposes. When prices are going up, it is considered good business to buy far ahead, and when prices are up, to buy as little as possible. It needs no argument to demonstrate that, if you buy materials at 10 cents a pound and the material goes later to 20 cents a pound, you will have a distinct advantage over the man who is compelled to buy at 20 cents. But we have found that thus buying ahead does not pay. It is entering into a guessing contest. It is not business. If a man buys a large stock at 10 cents, he is in a fine position as long as the other man is paying 20 cents. Then he later gets a chance to buy more of the material at 20 cents, and it seems to be a good buy because everything points to the price going to 30 cents. Having great satisfaction in his previous judgment, on which he made money, he of course makes the new purchase. Then the price drops, and he is just where he started. We have carefully figured over the years that buying ahead of requirements does not pay, that the gains on one purchase will be offset by the losses on another, and in the end we have gone to a great deal of trouble without any corresponding benefit. Therefore, in our buying, we simply get the best price we can for the quantity that we require. We do not buy less if the price be high, and we do not buy more if the price be low. We carefully avoid bargain lots in excess of requirements. It was not easy to reach that decision, but in the end speculation will kill any manufacturer. Give him a couple of good purchases on which he makes money, and before long he will be thinking about making money out of buying and selling than out of his legitimate business, and he will smash. The only way to keep out of trouble is to buy what one needs, no more and no less. That course removes one hazard from business. This buying experience is given at length because it explains our selling policy. Instead of giving attention to competitors or to demand, our prices are based on an estimate of what the largest possible number of people will want to pay, or can pay, for what we have to sell. And what has resulted from that policy is best evidenced by comparing the price of the touring car and the production. Year, price, production. 1909 to 10, $950, 18,664 cars. 1910 to 11, $780, 34,528 cars. 1911 to 12, $690, 78,440 cars. 1912 to 13, $600, 168,220 cars. 1913 to 14, $550, 248,307 cars. 1914 to 15, $490, 308,213 cars. 1915 to 16, $440, 533,921 cars. 1916 to 17, $360, 785,432 cars. 1917 to 18, $450, 706,584 cars. 1918 to 19, $525, 533,706 cars. The above 2 years were war years and the factory was in war work. 1919 to 20, $575 to $440, 996,660 cars. 1920 to 21, $440 to $355, 1,250,000 cars. The high prices of 1921 were, considering the financial inflation, not really high. At the time of writing, the price is $497. These prices are actually lower than they appear to be, because improvements in quality are being steadily made. We study every car in order to discover if it has features that might be developed and adapted. If anyone has anything better than we have, we want to know it, and for that reason we buy one of every new car that comes out. Usually the car is used for a while, put through a road test, taken apart, and studied as to how and of what everything is made. Scattered about Dearborn, there is probably one of every make of car on earth. Every little while, when we buy a new car, it gets into the newspapers and somebody remarks that Ford doesn't use the Ford. Last year we ordered a big Lanchester, which is supposed to be the best car in England. It lay in our Long Island factory for several months, and then I decided to drive it to Detroit. There were several of us, and we had a little caravan, the Lanchester, a Packard, and a Ford or two. I happened to be riding in the Lanchester, passing through a New York town, and when the reporters came up, they wanted to know right away why I was not riding in a Ford. Well, you see, "It is this way," I answered. "I am on a vacation now. I am in no hurry. We do not care much when we get home. That is the reason I am not in the Ford. You know, we also have a line of Ford stories. Our policy is to reduce the price, extend the operations, and improve the article. You will notice that the reduction of price comes first. We have never considered any costs as fixed. Therefore, we first reduce the price to a point where we believe more sales will result. Then we go ahead and try to make the price. We do not bother about the costs. The new price forces the costs down. The more usual way is to take the costs and then determine the price. And although that method may be scientific in the narrow sense, it is not scientific in the broad sense. Because what earthly use is it to know the cost if it tells you you cannot manufacture at a price at which the article can be sold? But more to the point is the fact that, although one may calculate what a cost is, and of course all of our costs are carefully calculated, no one knows what a cost ought to be. One of the ways of discovering what a cost ought to be is to name a price so low as to force everybody in the place to the highest point of efficiency. The low price makes everybody dig for profits. We make more discoveries concerning manufacturing and selling under this forced method than by any method of leisurely investigation. The payment of high wages fortunately contributes to the low costs because the men become steadily more efficient on account of being relieved of outside worries. The payment of $5 a day for an 8-hour day was one of the finest cost-cutting moves we ever made, and the $6 day wage is cheaper than the 5. How far this will go we do not know. We have always made a profit at the prices we have fixed, and, just as we have no idea how high wages will go, we also have no idea how low prices will go, but there is no particular use in bothering on that point. The tractor, for instance, was first sold for $750, then at $850, then at $625, and the other day we cut it 37% to $395. The tractor is not made in connection with the automobiles. No plant is large enough to make two articles. A shop has to be devoted to exactly one product in order to get the real economies. For most purposes, a man with a machine is better than a man without a machine. By the order of design of product and of manufacturing process, we were able to provide that kind of a machine which most multiplies the power of the hand, and therefore we give to that man a larger roll of service, which means that he is entitled to a larger share of comfort. Keeping that principle in mind, we can attack waste with a definite objective. We will not put into our establishment anything that is useless. We will not put up elaborate buildings as monuments to our success. The interest on the investment and the cost of their upkeep will only serve to add uselessly to the cost of what is produced. So these monuments of success are apt to end as tombs. A great administration building may be necessary. In me it arouses a suspicion that perhaps there is too much administration. We have never found a need for elaborate administration and would prefer to be advertised by our product than where we make our product. The standardization that effects large economies for the consumer results in profits of such gross magnitude to the producer that he can scarcely know what to do with his money. but his effort must be sincere, painstaking, and fearless. Cutting out a half a dozen models is not standardizing. It may be, and usually is, only the limiting of business. For if one is selling on the ordinary basis of profit, that is, on the basis of taking as much money away from the consumer as he will give up, then surely the consumer ought to have a wide range of choice. Standardization, then, is the final stage of the process. We start with consumer, work back through the design, and finally arrive at manufacturing. The manufacturing becomes a means to the end of service. It is important to bear this order in mind. As yet, the order is not thoroughly understood. The price relation is not understood. The notion persists that prices ought to be kept up. On the contrary, good business, large consumption, depends on their going down. And here is another point. The service must be the best you can give. It is considered good manufacturing practice, and not bad ethics, occasionally to change designs so that old models will become obsolete and new ones will have to be bought either because repair parts for the old cannot be had or because the new model offers a new sales argument which can be used to persuade a consumer to scrap what he has and buy something new. We have been told that this is good business, that it is clever business, that the object of business ought to be to get people to buy frequently, and that it is bad business to try to make anything that will last forever, because when once a man is sold he will not buy again. Our principle of business is precisely to the contrary. We cannot conceive how to serve the consumer unless we make for him something that, as far as we can provide, will last forever. We want to construct some kind of a machine that will last forever. It does not please us to have a buyer's car wear out or become obsolete. We want the man who buys one of our products never to have to buy another. We never make an improvement that renders any previous model obsolete. The parts of a specific model are not only interchangeable with all other cars of that model, but they are interchangeable with similar parts on all the cars that we have turned out. You can take a car of 10 years ago and, buying today's parts, make it with very little expense into a car of today. Having these objectives, the costs always come down under pressure. And since we have the firm policy of steady price reduction, there is always pressure. Sometimes it is just harder. Take a few more instances of saving. The sweepings net $600,000 a year. Experiments are constantly going on in the utilization of scrap. In one of the stamping operations, 6-inch circles of sheet metal are cut out. These formerly went into scrap. The waste worried the men. They worked to find uses for the discs. They found that the plates were just the right size and shape to stamp into radiator caps, but the metal was not thick enough. They tried a double thickness of plates, with the result that they made a cap which tests proved to be stronger than one made out of a single sheet of metal. We get 150,000 of those discs a day. We have now found a use for about 20,000 a day and expect to find further uses for the remainder. We saved about $10 each by making transmissions instead of buying them. We experimented with bolts and produced a special bolt made on what is called an upsetting machine with a rolled thread that was stronger than any bolt we could buy, although in its making was used only about one-third of the material that the outside manufacturers used. The saving on one style of bolt alone amounted to $500,000 a year. We used to assemble our cars at Detroit, and although by special packing we managed to get 5 or 6 into a freight car, we needed many hundreds of freight cars a day. Trains were moving in and out all the time. Once 1,000 freight cars were packed in a single day. A certain amount of congestion was inevitable. It is very expensive to knock down machines and crate them so they cannot be injured in transit. To say nothing of the transportation charges. Now, we assemble only 300 or 400 cars a day at Detroit, just enough for local needs. We now ship the parts to our assembling stations all over the United States, and in fact, pretty much all over the world, and the machines are put together there. Wherever it is possible for a branch to make a part more cheaply than we can make in Detroit and ship it to them, then the branch makes the part. The plant at Manchester, England, is making nearly an entire car. The tractor plant at Cork, Ireland, is making almost a complete tractor. This is an enormous saving of expense, and is only an indication of what may be done throughout industry generally, when each part of a composite article is made at the exact point where it may be made most economically. We are constantly experimenting with every material that enters into the car. We cut most of our own lumber from our own forests. We are experimenting in the manufacture of artificial leather, because we use about 40,000 yards of artificial leather a day. A penny here and a penny there runs into large amounts in the course of a year. The greatest development of all, however, is the River Rouge plant, which, when it is running to its full capacity, will cut deeply and in many directions into the price of everything we make. The whole tractor plant is now there. This plant is located on the river on the outskirts of Detroit, and the property covers 665 acres, enough for future development. It has a large slip and a turning basin capable of accommodating any lake steamship. A short-cut canal and some dredging will give a direct lake connection by way of the Detroit River. We use a great deal of coal. The coal comes directly from our mines over the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railway, which we control, to the Highland Park plant and the River Rouge plant. Part of it goes for steam purposes. Another part goes to the byproduct coke ovens, which we have established at the River Rouge plant. Coke moves on from the ovens by mechanical transmission to the blast furnaces. The low volatile gases from the blast furnaces are piped to the power plant boilers, where they are joined by the sawdust and the shavings from the body plant. The making of all our bodies has been shifted to this plant. In addition, the coke breeze, the dust in making of coke, is now also being utilized for stoking. The steam power plant is thus fired almost exclusively from what would otherwise be waste products. Immense steam turbines, directly coupled with dynamos, transform this power into electricity, and all of the machinery in the tractor and the body plants is run by individual motors from this electricity. In the course of time, it is expected that there will be sufficient electricity to run practically the whole Highland Park plant, and we shall then have to cut our coal bill. Among the byproducts of the coke ovens is a gas. It is piped both to the Rouge and Highland Park plants, where it is used for heat treat purposes, for the enameling ovens, for the car ovens, and the like. We formerly had to buy this gas. The ammonium sulfate is used for fertilizer. The benzol is a motor fuel. The small sizes of coke, not suitable for the blast furnaces, are sold to the employees, delivered free into their homes at much less than the ordinary market price. The largest size coke goes to the blast furnaces. There is no manual handling. We run the melted iron directly from the blast furnaces into great ladles. These ladles travel into the shops, and the iron is poured directly into the molds without another heating. We thus not only get a uniform quality of iron according to our own specifications and directly under our control, but we save a melting of pig iron and in fact cut out a whole process in manufacturing as well as making available all our own scrap. What all this will amount to in point of savings we do not know. That is, we do not know how great will be the saving, because the plant has not been running long enough to give more than an indication of what is ahead. And we save in so many directions: in transportation, in the generation of our power, in the generation of gas, in the expense in casting. And then over and above that is the revenue from the by-products and from the smaller sizes of coke. The investment to accomplish these objectives to date amounts to something over $40 million. How far we shall thus reach back to sources depends entirely on circumstances. Nobody anywhere can really do more than guess about the future costs of production. It is wiser to recognize that the future holds more than the past, that every day holds within it an improvement on the methods of the day before. But how about production? If every necessary of life were produced so cheaply and in such quantities, would not the world shortly be surfeited with goods? Will there not come a point when, regardless of price, people simply will not want anything more than what they already have? And if in the process of manufacturing fewer and fewer men are used, what is going to become of these men? How are they going to find jobs and live? Take the second point first. We mention many machines and many methods that displaced great numbers of men, and then someone asks, "Yes, that is a very fine idea from the standpoint of the proprietor, but how about these poor fellows whose jobs are taken away from them?" The question is entirely reasonable, but it is a little curious that it should be asked. For when were men ever really put out of work by the bettering of industrial processes? The stagecoach drivers lost their jobs with the coming of the railways. Should we have prohibited the railways and kept the stagecoach drivers? Were there more men working with the stagecoaches than are working on the railways? Should we have prevented the taxicab because its coming took the bread out of the mouths of the horse cab drivers? How does the number of taxicabs compare with the number of horse cabs when the latter were in their prime? The coming of shoe machinery closed most of the shops of those who made shoes by hand. When shoes were made by hand, only the very well-to-do could own more than a single pair of shoes, and most working people went barefooted in summer. Now hardly anyone has only one pair of shoes, and shoemaking is a great industry. No, every time you can so arrange that one man will do the work of two, you so add to the wealth of the country that there will be a new and better job for the man who is displaced. If whole industries changed overnight, then disposing of the surplus men would be a problem, but these changes do not occur as rapidly as that. They come gradually. In our own experience, a new place always opens for a man as soon as better processes have taken his old job. And what happens in my shops happens everywhere in industry. There are many times more men today employed in the steel industries than there were in the days when every operation was by hand. It has to be so. It always is so and always will be so. And if any man cannot see it, it is because he will not look beyond his own nose. Now as to saturation. We are continually asked, when will you get to the point of overproduction? When will there be more cars than people to use them? We believe it is possible some day to reach the point where all goods are produced so cheaply and in such quantities that overproduction will be a reality. But as far as we are concerned, we do not look forward to that condition with fear. We look forward to it with great satisfaction. Nothing could be more splendid than a world in which everybody has all that he wants. Our fear is that this condition will be too long postponed. As to our own products, that condition is very far away. We do not know how many motor cars a family will desire to use of the particular kind that we make. We know that, as the price has come down, the farmer, who at first used one car, and it must be remembered that it is not so very long ago that the farm market for motor cars was absolutely unknown, the limit of sales was at that time fixed by all the wise statistical sharps at somewhere near the number of millionaires in the country, now often uses two, and also he buys a truck. Perhaps, instead of sending workmen out to scattered jobs in a single car, it will be cheaper to send each worker out in a car of his own. That is happening with salesmen. The public finds its own consumptive needs with unerring accuracy, and since we no longer make motor cars or tractors, but merely the parts which then assembled become motor cars and tractors, the facilities as now provided would hardly be sufficient to provide replacements for 10 million cars, and it would be quite the same with any business. We do not have to bother about overproduction for some years to come, provided the prices are right. It is the refusal of people to buy on account of price that really stimulates real business. Then if we want to do business, we have to get the prices down without hurting the quality. Thus price reduction forces us to learn improved and less wasteful methods of production. One big part of the discovery is what normal in industry depends on managerial genius discovering better ways of doing things. If a man reduces his selling price to a point where he is making no profit or incurring a loss, then he simply is forced to discover how to make as good an article by a better method, making his new method produce the profit, and not. My Life and Work by Henry Ford, in collaboration with Samuel Crowther. Chapter 11. Money and Goods. The primary object of a manufacturing business is to produce, and if that objective is always kept, finance becomes a wholly secondary matter that has largely to do with bookkeeping. My own financial operations have been very simple. I started with the policy of buying and selling for cash, keeping a large fund of cash always on hand, taking full advantage of all discounts, and collecting interest on bank balances. I regard a bank principally as a place in which it is safe and convenient to keep money. The minutes we spend on a competitor's business we lose on our own. The minutes we spend in becoming expert in finance we lose in production. The place to finance a manufacturing business is the shop, and not the bank. I would not say that a man in business needs to know nothing at all about finance, but he is better off knowing too little than too much, for if he becomes too expert he will get into the way of thinking that he can borrow money instead of earning it, and then he will borrow more money to pay back what he has borrowed, and instead of being a business man he will be a note juggler, trying to keep in the air a regular flock of bonds and notes. If he is a really expert juggler, he may keep going quite a long time in this fashion, but some day he is bound to make a miss and the whole collection will come tumbling down around him. Manufacturing is not to be confused with banking, and I think that there is a tendency for too many business men to mix up in banking and for too many bankers to mix up in business. The tendency is to distort the true purposes of both business and banking, and that hurts both of them. The money has to come out of the shop, not out of the bank, and I have found that the shop will never answer every possible requirement, and in one case, when it was believed that the company was rather seriously in need of funds, the shop when called on raised a larger sum than any bank in this country could loan. We have been thrown into finance mostly on the way of denial. Some years back we had to keep standing a denial that the Ford Motor Company was owned by the Standard Oil Company, and with that denial, for convenience's sake, we coupled a denial that we were connected with any other concern or that we intended to sell cars by mail. Last year the best liked rumor was that we were down in Wall Street hunting for money. I did not bother to deny that. It takes too much time to deny everything. Instead, we demonstrated that we did not need any money. Since then I have heard nothing more about being financed by Wall Street. We are not against borrowing money, and we are not against bankers. We are against trying to make borrowed money take the place of work. We are against the kind of banker who regards a business as a melon to be cut. The thing is to keep money and borrowing and finance generally in their proper place, and in order to do that one has to consider exactly for what the money is needed and how much it is going to be paid off. Money is only a tool in business, it is just part of the machinery. You might as well borrow 100,000 lathes as $100,000 if the trouble is inside your business. More lathes will not cure it, neither will more money. Only heavier doses of brains and thought and wise courage can cure. A business that misuses what it has will continue to misuse what it can get. The point is, cure the misuse. When that is done, the business will begin to make its own money, just as a repaired human body begins to make sufficient pure blood. Borrowing may easily become an excuse for not boring into the trouble. Borrowing may easily become a sop for laziness and pride. Some businessmen are too lazy to get into overalls and go down to see what is the matter. Or they are too proud to permit the thought that anything they have originated could go wrong. But the laws of business are like the law of gravity, and the man who opposes them feels their power. Borrowing for expansion is one thing, borrowing to make up for mismanagement and waste is quite another. You do not want money for the latter, for the reason that money cannot do the job. Waste is corrected by economy. Mismanagement is corrected by brains. Neither of these correctives has anything to do with money. Indeed, money under certain circumstances is their enemy, and many a businessman thanks his stars for the pinch which showed him that his best capital was in his own brains and not in bank loans. Borrowing under circumstances is just like a drunkard taking another drink to cure the effect of the last one. It does not do what it is expected to do. It simply increases the difficulty. Tightening up the loose places in a business is much more profitable than any amount of new capital at 7%. The internal ailments of business are the ones that require most attention. Business, in the sense of trading with the people, is largely a matter of filling the wants of the people. If you make what they need, and sell it at a price which makes possession a help and not a hardship, then you will do business as long as there is business to do. People buy what helps them just as naturally as they drink water. But the process of making the article will require constant care. Machinery wears out and needs to be restored. Men grow uppish, lazy, or careless. A business is men and machines united in the production of a commodity, and both the man and the machines need repairs and replacements. Sometimes it is the men higher up who most need revamping, and they themselves are always the last to recognize it. When a business becomes congested with bad methods, when a business becomes ill through lack of attention to one or more of its functions, when executives sit comfortably back in their chairs as if the plans they inaugurated are going to keep them going forever, when business becomes a mere plantation on which to live, and not a big work which one has to do, then you may expect trouble. You will wake up some fine morning and find yourself doing more business than you have ever done before, and getting less out of it. You will find yourself short of money. You can borrow money, and you can do it, oh, so easily. People will crowd money on you. It is the most subtle temptation the young business man has. But if you do borrow money, you are simply giving a stimulant to whatever may be wrong. You feed the disease. Is a man more wise with borrowed money than he is with his own? Not as a usual thing. To borrow under such conditions is to mortgage a declining property. The time for a business man to borrow money, if ever, is when he does not need it. That is, when he does not need it as a substitute for the things he ought himself to do. If a man's business is in excellent condition and in need of expansion, it is comparatively safe to borrow, but if a business is in need of money through mismanagement, then the thing to do is to get into the business and correct the trouble from the inside, not poultice it with loans from the outside. My financial policy is a result of my sales policy. I hold that it is better to sell a large number of articles at a small profit than to sell a few at a large profit. This enables a larger number of people to buy, and it gives a larger number of men employment at good wages. It permits the planning of production, the elimination of dull seasons, and the waste of carrying an idle plant. Thus results a suitable, continuous business, and if you will think it over, you will discover that most so-called urgent financing is made necessary because of a lack of planned, continuous business. Reducing prices is taken by the short-sighted to be the same as reducing the income of a business. It is very difficult to deal with that sort of a mind because it is so totally lacking in even the background knowledge of what business is. For instance, I was once asked, when contemplating a reduction of $80 a car, whether on a production of 500,000 cars this would not reduce the income of the company by $40,000,000. Of course, if one sold only 500,000 cars at the new price, the income would be reduced $40,000,000, which is an interesting mathematical calculation that has nothing whatsoever to do with business, because unless you reduce the price of an article, the sales do not continuously increase, and therefore the business has no stability. If a business is not increasing, it is bound to be decreasing, and a decreasing business always needs a lot of financing. Old-time business went on the doctrine that prices should always be kept up to the highest point at which people will buy. Really modern business has to take the opposite view. Bankers and lawyers can rarely appreciate this fact. They confuse inertia with stability. It is perfectly beyond their comprehension that the price should ever voluntarily be reduced. That is why putting the usual type of banker or lawyer into the management of a business is courting disaster. Reducing prices increases the volume and disposes of finance, provided one regards the inevitable profit as a trust fund with which to conduct more and better business. Our profit, because of the rapidity of the turnover in the business and the great volume of sales, has, no matter what the price at which the product was sold, always been large. We have had a small profit per article, but a large aggregate profit. The profit is not constant. After cutting the prices, the profits for a time run low, but then the inevitable economies begin to get in their work and the profits go high again. But they are not distributed as dividends. I have always insisted on the payment of small dividends, and the company has today no stockholders who wanted a different policy. I regard business profits above a small percentage as belonging more to the business than to the stockholders. The stockholders, to my way of thinking, ought to be only those who are active in the business and who will regard the company as an instrument of service rather than as a machine for making money. If large profits are made, and working to serve forces them to be large, then they should be in part turned back into the business so that it may be still better fitted to serve, and in part passed on to the purchaser. During 1 year our profits were so much larger than we expected them to be that we voluntarily returned $50 to each purchaser of a car. We felt that unwittingly we had overcharged the purchaser by that much. My price policy, and hence my financial policy, came up in a suit brought against the company several years ago to compel the payment of larger dividends. On the witness stand I gave the policy then in force, and which is still in force. It is this. In the first place, I hold that it is better to sell a large number of cars at a reasonably small margin than to sell fewer cars at a large margin of profit. I hold this because it enables a large number of people to buy and enjoy the use of a car, and because it gives a larger number of men employment at good wages. Those are aims I have in life, but I would not be counted a success. I would be, in fact, a flat failure if I could not accomplish that and at the same time make a fair amount of profit for myself and the men associated with me in business. This policy I hold is good business policy because it works, because with each succeeding year we have been able to put our car within the reach of greater and greater numbers, give employment to more and more men, and, at the same time, through the volume of business, increase our own profits beyond anything we had hoped for or even dreamed of when we started. Bear in mind, every time you reduce the price of the car without reducing the quality, you increase the possible number of purchasers. There are many men who will pay $360 for a car who would not pay $440. We had in round numbers 500,000 buyers of cars on the $440 basis, and I figure that on the $360 basis we can increase the sales to possibly 800,000 cars for the year. Less profit on each car, but more cars, more employment of labor, and in the end we shall get all the total profit we ought to make. And let me say right here that I do not believe that we should make such an awful profit on our cars. A reasonable profit is right, but not too much. So it has been my policy to force the price of the car down as fast as production would permit, and give the benefits to users and laborers, with resulting surprisingly enormous benefits to ourselves. This policy does not agree with the general opinion that a business is to be managed to the end that stockholders can take out the largest possible amount of cash. Therefore, I do not want stockholders in the ordinary sense of the term. They do not help forward the ability to serve. My ambition is to employ more and more men and to spread, insofar as I am able, the benefits of the industrial system that we are working to found. We want to help build lives and homes. This requires that the largest share of the profits be put back into productive enterprise. Hence we have no place for the non-working stockholders. The working stockholder is more anxious to increase his opportunity to serve than to bank dividends. If it at any time became a question between lowering wages or abolishing dividends, I would abolish dividends. That time is not apt to come, for, as I have pointed out, there is no economy in low wages. It is bad financial policy to reduce wages because it also reduces buying power. If one believes that leadership brings responsibility, then a part of that responsibility is in seeing that those whom one leads shall have an adequate opportunity to earn a living. Finance concerns not merely the profit or solvency of a company. It also comprehends the amount of money that the company turns back to the community through wages. There is no charity in this. There is no charity in proper wages. It is simply that no company can be said to be stable which is not so well managed that it can afford a man an opportunity to do a great deal of work and therefore to earn a good wage. There is something sacred about wages. They represent homes and families and domestic destinies. People ought to tread very carefully when approaching wages. On the cost sheet, wages are mere figures. Out in the world, wages are bread boxes and coal bins, babies' cradles and children's education, family comforts and contentment. On the other hand, there is something just as sacred about capital, which is used to provide the means by which work can be made productive. Nobody is helped if our industries are sucked dry of their lifeblood. There is something just as sacred about a shop that employs thousands of men as there is about a home. The shop is the mainstay of all the finer things which the home represents. If we want the home to be happy, we must contrive to keep the shop busy. The whole justification of the profits made by the shop is that they are used to make doubly secure the homes dependent on that shop and to create more jobs for other men. If profits go to swell a personal fortune, that is one thing. If they go to provide a sounder basis for business, better working conditions, better wages, more extended employment, that is quite another thing. Capital thus employed should not be carelessly tampered with. It is for the service of all, though it may be under the direction of one. Profits belong in three places. They belong to the business, to keep it steady, progressive, and sound. They belong to the men who helped produce them. And they belong also, in part, to the public. A successful business is profitable to all three of these interests: planner, producer, and purchaser. People whose profits are excessive when measured by any sound standard should be the first to cut prices, but they never are. They pass all their extra costs down the line until the whole burden is borne by the consumer. And besides doing that, they charge the consumer a percentage on the increased charges. Their whole business philosophy is, get while the getting is good. They are the speculators, the exploiters, the no-good element that is always injuring legitimate business. There is nothing to be expected from them. They have no vision. They cannot see beyond their own cash registers. These people can talk more easily about a 10 or 20% cut in wages than they can about a 10 or 20% cut in profits. But a businessman, surveying the whole community in all its interests and wishing to serve that community, ought to be able to make his contribution to stability. It has been our policy always to keep on hand a large amount of cash. The cash balance in recent years has usually been in excess of $50 million. This is deposited in banks all over the country. We do not borrow, but we have established lines of credit so that if we so cared, we might raise a very large amount of money by bank borrowing. But keeping the cash reserve makes borrowing unnecessary. Our provision is only to be prepared to meet an emergency. I have no prejudice against proper borrowing. It is merely that I do not want to run the danger of having the control of the business, and hence the particular idea of service to which I am devoted, taken into other hands. A considerable part of finance is in the overcoming of seasonal operation. The flow of money ought to be nearly continuous. One must work steadily in order to work profitably. Shutting down involves great waste. It brings the waste of unemployment of men, the waste of unemployment of equipment, and the waste of restricted future sales through the higher prices of interrupted production. That has been one of the problems we had to meet. We could not manufacture cars to stock during the winter months when purchases are less than in spring or summer. Where or how could any one store 500,000 cars? And if stored, how could they be shipped in the rush season? And who would find the money to carry such a stock of cars, even if they could be stored? Seasonal work is hard on the working force. Good mechanics will not accept jobs that are good for only part of the year. To work in full force 12 months of the year guarantees workmen of ability, builds up a permanent manufacturing organization, and continually improves the product. The men in the factory, through uninterrupted service, become more familiar with the operations. The factory must build, the sales department must sell, and the dealer must buy cars all the year through. if each would enjoy the maximum profit to be derived from the business. If the retail buyer will not consider purchasing except in seasons, a campaign of education needs to be waged, proving the all the year around value of a car rather than the limited season value. And while the educating is being done, the manufacturer must build and the dealer must buy in anticipation of business. We were the first to meet the problem in the automobile business. The selling of Ford cars is a merchandising proposition. In the days when every car was built to order and 50 cars a month a big output, it was reasonable to wait for the sale before ordering. The manufacturer waited for the order before building. We very shortly found that we could not do business on order. The factory could not be built large enough, even were it desirable, to make between March and August all the cars that were ordered during those months. Therefore, years ago began the campaign of education to demonstrate that a Ford was not a summer luxury, but a year-round necessity. Coupled with that came the education of the dealer into the knowledge that even if he could not sell so many cars in winter as in summer, it would pay him to stock in winter for the summer and thus be able to make instant delivery. Both plans have worked out. In most parts of the country, cars are used almost as much in winter as in summer. It has been found that they will run in snow, ice, or mud, in anything. Hence, the winter sales are constantly growing larger, and the seasonal demand is in part lifted from the dealer, and he finds it profitable to buy ahead in anticipation of needs. Thus we have no seasons in the plant. The production, up until the last couple of years, has been continuous, excepting for the annual shutdowns for inventory. We have had an interruption during the period of extreme depression, but it was an interruption made necessary in the process of readjusting ourselves to the market conditions. In order to attain continuous production and hence a continuous turning over of money, we have had to plan our operations with extreme care. The plan of production is worked out very carefully each month between the sales and production departments with the object of producing enough cars so that those in transit will take care of the orders in hand. Formerly, when we assembled and shipped cars, this was of the highest importance, because we had no place in which to store finished cars. Now we ship parts instead of cars and assemble only those required for the Detroit district. That makes the planning no less important, for if the production stream and the order stream are not approximately equal, we should be either jammed with unsold parts or behind in our orders. When you are turning out the parts to make 4,000 cars a day, just a very little carelessness in overestimating orders will pile up a finished inventory running into the millions. That makes the balancing of operations an exceedingly delicate matter. In order to earn the proper profit on our narrow margin, we must have a rapid turnover. We make cars to sell, not to store, and a month's unsold production would turn into a sum the interest on which alone would be enormous. The production is planned a year ahead, and the number of cars to be made in each month of the year is scheduled, for of course it is a big problem to have the raw materials and such parts as we still buy from the outside flowing in consonance with production. We can no more afford to carry large stocks of finished than we can of raw material. Everything has to move in and move out, and we have had some narrow escapes. Some years ago the plant of the Diamond Manufacturing Company burned down. They were making radiator parts for us and the brass parts, tubings and castings. We had to move quickly or take a big loss. We got together the heads of all our departments, the pattern makers and the draughtsmen. They worked from 24 to 48 hours on a stretch. They made new patterns. The Diamond Company leased a plant and got some machinery in by express. We furnished the other equipment for them, and in 20 days they were shipping again. We had enough stock on hand to carry us over, say, for 7 or 8 days, but that fire prevented us shipping cars for 10 or 15 days. Except for our having stock ahead, it would have held us up for 20 days, and our expenses would have gone right on. To repeat, the place in which to finance is the shop. It has never failed us, and once, when it was thought that we were hard up for money, it served rather conclusively to demonstrate how much better finance can be conducted from the inside than from the outside. End of chapter 11.